Hello, my beautiful patroonies, and possibly at a later date, YouTuberlets, tubelets. Today's video, well, I don't know. Today's video, we are talking about spiritual inheritance, the wounding, the shadows, the things that we carry that are not meant from us, that may come from our ancestry. Now, we have kind of covered this a little bit already on Patreon. So if you're on here for the cycle, you know about this from the podcast. So we're just going to go over the little piece that I shared, and then we're going to go into a little bit more depth. So this cycle has had many lessons of wounds of our ancestors and how we carry them. We have been discussing that in depth and looking at how we can create boundaries when we find ourselves carrying wound inheritance. There is some scientific and psychological study to show we can inherit trauma in the womb space, and we have a shared physical space with both our mother and grandmother, something that we've talked about here on Patreon already. Spiritually, this can have even deeper implications as we are all connected through the spiritual ecosystem. And if you've been with me for any length of time, you know that I keep touching on the idea of multiverse, parallel, past lives, or actually sort of different lives, different tendrils that we might be living at any given point. I'm not going to go into that here because it gets very complicated, and I've described that somewhere else. So it's on the podcast if you guys want to check that out if you haven't already. So as we move towards Samhain, we can visualize ourselves standing in the footprints of those who walked before us. This is a spiritual activity that we can partake in, a visualization, a kind of journey work, and it's wonderful. It can be very difficult. It can bring up all kinds of shadows, especially if we don't want to stand in the footprints of certain ancestors, and even immediate family that have passed on that we were at odds with or we don't agree with their life choices. But it is something that can be worthwhile when you are ready. You shouldn't force yourself into any situations which are going to cause real spiritual and psychological and emotional harm. We honor our ancestors as we stand in their footprints, but we also leave their woundings at the liminal doorway. We basically ask them to wipe their feet on the mat. We cannot carry more than was meant for us, not in this lifetime. And so, with love and respect, we cut the threads that tie us to those negative or destructive patterns that we cannot explain within us, that keep impacting us, not because of our life experience, not because of our memory, but because of our ancestral inheritance. So let's go over this and what this means. And I'm going to try and keep it simplistic to try and help explain what I mean by this. So first and foremost, what is a good indicator of an ancestral wounding that is not something that we're supposed to carry? Firstly, are there patterns of behavior, things that you're deathly afraid of, or negative things that keep coming up in your lifetime, your cycles that keep impacting you, and you cannot fully explain it? Now, I have said that I feel like we carry fear from other lives with us, like past lives, if you will, or parallel lives, if you will, depending on how you see those. Again, trying not to describe all of that in detail again. So, for example, if we have died in one incarnation or have come to grievous harm in a different life incarnation by falling off a cliff, then that energy, that memory can reverberate down through the tendrils of our being, through the spiritual ecosystem, into our collective consciousness. And that can be twofold, because that can be the collective consciousness of everything, every human being, every spirit, every creature within the spiritual ecosystem knows it's not the best of ideas to jump off a cliff. And so that collective consciousness comes down into our sort of makeup, our astral makeup. But also, if we've had very specific past or parallel life experiences, then we can sort of, our soul kind of resonates down that information, and that fear travels down into our collectiveness, our soul. And also, if our ancestors have had close calls or have lost someone and suffered massive grief and massive trauma as a result of somebody falling off a cliff, then we could, by the scientific study and by the psychological study, possibly inherit that biologically. It can travel through in the womb space, it can travel through from what we are told collectively through storytelling as a unit. And that doesn't have to be blood family unit, but it tends to be quote unquote family units that pass these stories down and they become a part of us, which goes to show how important words and storytelling can be, as that's how human beings throughout time have passed wisdom and knowledge down to their ancestors. This way, from ancestors to us. Storytelling has been a massive part of that. And so if there is a wound story, a spiritual inheritance of a wound story, great grandpapa Joe, he went off a cliff, you should be afraid of cliffs, you should watch those heights, blah, blah, blah. And that gets kind of inherited down and it becomes rationalized, it becomes normal, it becomes part of the storytelling that you are also given. So you can be being affronted by all of these things on many, many levels that come down through the spiritual ecosystem, the biological line, and the storytelling, that all come down into your vessel and make you pick up on woundings, wounders. And this doesn't have to just be phobias, it's just the falling off the cliff is the easiest descriptor for that for me to give to you guys here, talking about that idea. So we can inherit wounds, pain, negative cycles. So if you have massive phobias that you can't explain, there's not like a simple cause and effect. I have an issue with heights because I nearly died as a young child by falling through a open rope bridge, and I would have gone right down in this cave and stalagmites and I would have been dead. I would have been impaled, and that stayed with me. So that to me is cause and effect of being, you know, terrified of that at a very young age. But if there is a wound there or a complete pattern that keeps happening that's not necessarily based on your experiences, or you feel like maybe it wasn't your experience in the beginning, but because you have lived this cycle yourself, it then has become part of your wound space. You're then carrying the wounds and the pain and the impact from other people on your shoulders, from other ancestors, and then that's kind of made finite into your life, but then you sort of get the consequences of it, you living it out, trying to fix it almost by your life experiences. So for example, if there has been a generational thing, for example, with your grandmother and your mother having terrible relationships with particular kinds of men, and that has been then passed on, and that trauma, that pain, that how that feels has been then passed on, and there is an element of psychology in the immediate passing on of these problems as well, so that as we see it, that becomes our normality. We almost expect it for ourselves. It ties into self-worth and things of that nature, as well as the possibility of inheriting wound spaces. So we have to just be aware that there are many factors, and it's not just simply, usually anyway, it's not nearly as simply as that has been passed on. And one way of looking at identifying that is, do you have these same experiences? Do you have these same terrible occurrences within your life? Is it occurring the same way, or the same issue, the same, say it was emotionally abusive verbal crap that your grandmother put up with, and then your mother put up with, and then maybe you are as well. And so is there an identifier of a through line which you are carrying, which is heavier than you can cope with because it's not just yours? And then there are certain occurrences which were fascinating, and I was reading them in the book, It Didn't Start With You, that they can be identified by language. By the language we use is a key identifier in how we have internalized the stories and possibly the inherited trauma of our ancestors that we may not even be aware of. So the way that we speak when we're under duress, the phrases that we use are all very telling of the kinds of trauma that we may have inherited from our ancestors, which I found fascinating. Looking at the exact wording that you use in situations where you're feeling upset, angry, depressed, stressed, and like overwhelmed by certain cycles of patterns of behavior and things. You're like, why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? And then suddenly you realize that there could be this inherited response to these circumstances, that it's almost like they were living it and you're trying to resolve it, and that's not really up to you. That's not the destiny of your heart and soul in this incarnation. That's not the lesson that you're meant to be here to be learning, which could be anything, but it's certainly not somebody else's lesson, whomever it might be. And so this Samhain, I thought it would be really interesting to just kind of highlight that to you guys first and foremost, because I found this fascinating as I was learning about it and reading about it and sort of mulling it around in my mind. And then what we can do to create a line in the sand, ask our ancestors to wipe their feet on the mat, because we don't want to be that doormat. We're not the doormat, we're a whole person. We don't want to be carrying that anymore, because it is impacting on us in a negative way. And it has been at the forefront of my mind all month, to be honest. And that kind of heaviness of carrying things that aren't really for you. And sometimes I think a lot of us can realize how easy it is to pick up on things in childhood from our immediate family, like, oh, well, that's just was always the normal, so I didn't realize it was abnormal until later, sort of. That's what people say. But we don't necessarily realize that we shared a womb space with our grandmother, for example, and we don't necessarily think about, because you were a viable little egg in your mother's womb space when she was in the womb. And just in case anyone missed that podcast or doesn't know that information, and so that is easy to pick up on. We can kind of figure that quite easily. That's kind of a response to an accessibility to counseling and therapy, which in the West at least is either quite accessible or people know about it, even if they can't access it directly. And so that sort of impact is kind of common knowledge. But when it comes to that we might be carrying that is not common knowledge, it can be really mind-blowing. And for me it really was. And the example in the book that I mentioned talks about how a woman was using the idea of being breathless, being gassed to death. And what it actually was that she had inherited trauma from her ancestors who had been in gas chambers in the war, in the World War II. And so as I was looking at my own language, I was picking up things that I realized in depth with like big light bulb moments of where a lot of certain shadows have come from and how to start looking at resolving them. So one of the ways that we can start resolving this, especially on the spiritual level, is what I have come to decide to do this Samhain. And the first hint of what we're doing is something we've already mentioned: standing in the footsteps of our ancestors. So you can do this in a number of ways. You can, depending on what you have available to you. So if you have an old pair of shoes from one of your ancestors, you could literally stand in some shoes if you want. If you have nothing at all, you can just do a visual, like I don't really have anything at all, so you can just do a visualization, or you can go outside like completely, or you can go outside if it's the weather is amenable, which it's not really this week, but if it is, you can go outside with your shoes on and stomp on the floor, make some good footprints, and then take your shoes off and then put your feet in. And so it's sort of like the shoes and the footprints are yours, but they are a result of all of your ancestors, because you wouldn't be here without them. So there is that through line and symbolism that you can use. And then you, depending on whether you are doing it physically or visualizing, you then bring the visualization into this process of you stepping into their footprints. And you can do one of two things depending on how difficult it is for you when you are stood in that place. You can either experience what they experienced. You can feel it, you can see it, you can invite that into your third eye mind's clairvoyance to see it as if it's a memory, to understand it, or have a conversation with the individual. So visualize them in front of you talking to you about their experiences. Or if that is too stressful, too traumatizing, if there is too much there, you can just simply step into it and kind of honor that occurs without kind of downloading that into your energy field. Just make a statement of, I acknowledge this, I understand this, but at the same time, this is not for me. And that is the end goal, regardless of whether you felt it and experienced it or not. So even once you have felt it and experienced it, you then want to push it out into the earth. You want to release it and say, and bury it, basically. It's combining that kind of funeral energy, that burying something into the earth to be rotted down, to be reborn, so new life may grow from it, whilst honoring the memory, but not carrying the weight. So it's kind of, once we have honored and acknowledged and experienced it, maybe, then we push that energy down into the earth, and we make very clear. Wording is important, as we have mentioned this week in the Star Drive Overdrive, with regards to how our words are power, how witchcraft can work, how voice witchery works. So we state, and out loud is better for this, because you are putting your breath and your voice, which reverberates out into the spiritual ecosystem, but it also creates a barrier, because your ancestors don't speak out loud the same way that you do. They still can speak and communicate, but the way that your voice is in this physical incarnation is yours and yours alone. So it creates that barrier to, in my mind at least, to allowing those energies to continue, because you're speaking out, you're pushing out, or pushing away, you're being firm in your spell, you're being firm in your words, and you're sort of, it's almost giving a eulogy for the wounding of your ancestors. But at the same time, that eulogy is a little bit of a death space for you too, because that's stopping you from carrying the wounds of your ancestors. So in those footprints, here I stand, I honor the experiences and the memories of those who've gone before me. I see and acknowledge their pain. I know that this hurt them, that this harmed them, that this perhaps was a wound from which they never recovered, they never healed. And I feel and honor that pain. At the same time, it is not for me to carry forward that pain. I've come here to draw a line in the dirt, line in the sand, line in time, a line in my energy field, and say that this boundary now surrounds me. This boundary cannot be crossed. As I place their memory into the earth and honor it, I take away its power to impact my current lifetime, my current incarnation. I bury it, I place it in the earth with honor, with respect, but with ending. And with that, we push that into the earth, and we allow it to cease to impact on us. And we cleanse ourselves out good and proper afterwards and do some protection. And we may need to repeat this a few times, especially if things are entrenched, and especially if things are multifaceted. Because if things come from an ancestral place, as well as a learnt place or a biological place, then it's going to take different kinds of healing work in conjunction. So just be aware that one spiritual kind of funeral for the ancestral wounding memory is not necessarily going to heal and resolve everything, because that's not usually how healing works. Healing is usually way more complicated than that. And it takes looking at the different factors, the different roots that require attention and shadow work and healing. But this is something that we can do to begin the process of not carrying things which are not intended for us and yet are impacting negatively on our lives as spiritual practitioners and spiritual folk. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and that is it for me for this one. We shall also be looking at spiritual inheritance blessings, so the positive side of things, and that will be on the very next one. So many blessings, guys, and I'll talk to you soon.